Today's guest on the Rattlesnake podcast is Bettina Arndt. Bettina is a writer and a social commentator that is trained in clinical psychology. She's been a very controversial voice in Australia for doing the thing that you're not allowed to do, which is advocating for men. And this one hits home for me because I'm going to be telling my own story about a false allegation that I had to go through. We're also going to be discussing the recent Russell Brand allegations, Bettina's thoughts on the red pill, and also the real reason why men are actually killing themselves. So I hope you guys enjoy this as much as I did. And if you want to find Bettina's work, it's all going to be linked below. Let's get into it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time. You do activism, but on the men's side of things, which is unusual these days. Why do you feel the need to stick up for men?
Well, I started off doing things for women many years ago, but I was always interested in equality. I was interested in a level playing field for men and women. And when it became obvious that women had actually achieved most of what they were going for, you know, we had lots of choices in our lives, but that turned out not to be the feminist goal anymore. They wanted to advantage women at the expense of men, and that was enough for me. I was out in the media writing about all sorts of social issues, and if you put the men's point of view out there, you got sort of howled down, because they were only interested in hearing what women had to say about every conceivable issue. And it drove me crazy. And, you know, I've always had a certain attraction for what you're not allowed to talk about. I mean, I started my career as a sex therapist when sex was really taboo and you weren't allowed to, you know, to talk about openly about, you know, stuff we do with our bodies. And that had a certain attraction for me. And in the same way, when it became painfully obvious that feminists were closing down debate on what was happening to men in our society, that attracted me. I'm like a moth to the flames. I can't resist.
Fair enough. So your book, Men Too, that was in the wake of...
You have to say hashtag Men Too.
Hashtag Men Too. Hashtag Men Too.
That's the joke, of course.
Of course. So hashtag Men Too. That was in the wake. It was a reaction to the Me Too campaign. What motivated you to write that book, especially in a time where that was one of the most hot button issues? I mean, you've just described that. Why at that time did you decide that you had to write that book?
Well, I really pulled together articles I've been writing for the previous, 4 or 5 years, really, because by then I was out there systematically saying, this stinks what's going on for men. Men are having a really lousy deal in our society. They're constantly being discriminated against in all sorts of ways. They're facing increasing injustice in our courts. So I pulled together all those articles, and that's what the book is all about.
So at that time, I mean, it seemed as though like the guys who were being accused of these things were just guilty straight away without even a trial, and trial by social media. And it feels to me as though that's kind of still happening, although there have been a few cases recently where the guy has maybe, I said gotten the upper hand as if it's like a competition, but the Johnny Depp case, I think that there was a few pretty key details that sort of exonerated him from the public opinion. But now we've seen Julian Assange suffer the same thing, where he had a rape allegation against him that ended up being false. And now we've recently just seen Russell Brand have allegations against him. Have you been following that story?
Yeah, I've just been having a look at that. I mean, is it a coincidence that when he changed sides in a sense and started speaking out about climate change and COVID and the lefties decided to have a go at his sexual past? Whereas, I mean, 10 years ago, he was out there, he was known to be screwing everybody, every girl that moved, and this was all over the papers, and this was fantastic, and they had celebrated this, and his promiscuity was something. I mean, and now it's been discovered that they're absolutely out there digging and digging and digging, trying to find women who will accuse him. Well, if you've had as many women as he has, I mean, you're going to find some who he disappointed, who hoped to be a girl that he'd want to see them more than once or whatever it was. Very dangerous for men. I mean, I think it's dangerous for almost any man in our society, because you don't have to have been a player. You don't have to be misbehaving in any sort of sexual sense to have girls decide to take vengeance on you. They can just be annoyed. You can be a perfectly proper boss who've behaved yourself all your life, and yet you didn't give someone a promotion, you spoke very harshly to someone you were employing at some point, whatever. You could have done anything, and women now know that they can destroy you by a sexual accusation. That's the world we live in. And it's just been really frightening. And I've been in an amazing situation in Australia because many people know I've been one of the few people really looking carefully at what's happening to men in this area, particularly in relation to sexual assault. And therefore, I get the stories all the time. I never go anywhere without someone taking me aside and saying, this. I was talking to someone this week whose relative was accused of a historic sexual assault case, a rape, a sexual assault, and he hung himself. Just ghastly, because it was a false accusation, but he realised you never clear yourself of these crimes. Your reputation never recovers. And that's what's so just grueling. One of the things I've been doing in recent years, I brought together a lot of mothers. I've always had mums come to me, my sons, 19-year-old son's facing this accusation, or he's split up with his wife and now she's alleging this and that and the other. And so I thought, well, let's bring together some of these mothers. We've got a group called Mothers of Sons and tell their stories. These are women. This is a world where we're supposed to believe women, aren't we? And listen to women. Mm-hmm. We spent a whole year putting together their stories, putting out videos, telling exactly what had happened to these families. And the media took no notice of us whatsoever. They only believe some women who conform to their narrative. And if you challenge their narrative, they absolutely shut you down.
It's a tough one because as much as you want people to be heard and you want these accusations to be listened to, there are going to be some sociopaths out there who take this and are opportunistic about it and want to use it to destroy people. And I saw that with the Julian Assange case because he was obviously innocent of that rape case in Sweden, and they tried to ruin his reputation and defame him because of that. And then and we might be seeing the exact same thing with Russell Brand at the moment. Like you said, he's had thousands of partners. And this isn't an investigation where people are going and looking at the evidence carefully and keeping it under wraps. No, this is journalists and whatever other powers want him destroyed, going and trying to dig into his past and find anything that they can find, make it as dramatic as they possibly can, and then ruin his reputation. And I mentioned in my email that I'd had a similar story of somebody doing a false allegation on me and a friend of mine. And the friend of mine was a famous footballer in Australia. And I won't go into too much details and names just out of respect for him because he wants to move on with his life. But it was a historical case of a random girl 5 years prior to the allegation, when I was 19, coming out and saying that I touched her boob when I was 19. That's what it was. And then the media got a hold of it because my friend was a well-known footballer, and they ran with it. And they were publishing articles, and it wasn't even sexual assault. It was called indecent assault. It was what we got charged with. Later on, because it was just built on a house of cards. It was a terrible story. It was a terrible false allegation. It got dropped, and they paid us back all of our fees, and it was realized that she was lying. But yeah, at the time though, the media ran with it.
Nothing happened to her, did it, Jake? I assume nothing happened to her.
No name, no penalty, no nothing.
No perjury charge. Women can make these allegations and have no consequences. They're never named. The male's name is spread all over the newspapers, particularly as in your situation where you're associated with someone really famous. Yeah. And nothing happens to it if it doesn't come off.
Yeah, but it wasn't just that they published it. It was that they published it in the most dramatic and most embellished way possible. The articles, if you search my full name, which is Jake Edgington, which is my real name, I don't use that because it's too much of a tongue twister, not much of a stage name. Yeah. But if you search my real name, you'll see the revealed of the sex assault, and they called it sex assault. And then they said that there were 6 witnesses. So the media tried to act as though I had raped someone and there were 6 witnesses. When anyone who knows this sort of stuff knows that myself, my friend, her, one of her friends who wasn't there even at the party, another guy who completely said something completely different. Anyways, it was just a complete embellishment, and that's there forever. There's no articles saying, oh, we got this wrong. Sorry, we're going to take it down. There was no apology to me. You Google my name, that's what comes up. And that's going to be with me for the rest of my life. And as soon as that happened, I'd been working at the Salvation Army for 2 years, and I lost my job straight away. And I loved that job. I was working at a homeless shelter, and I used to work with the homeless youth. And now I was treated like a sex offender, treated like, because I lost my ability to be able to work with children. So I lost my card, and I got fired straight away. And this was just off like an allegation. And the media, I went into a pre-court hearing, and the media were all in the pre-court hearing. Like I was looking at, it was a Zoom call during COVID, and there was about 4 lines of different people in there. And I started Googling their names. There was ABC, Herald Sun. Oh my God. And then that day it just went all over the media. So, I mean, you must get stories like this all the time.
But I mean, I'm very pleased you're telling the story, Jake. I think it's incredibly important that men like you speak out. It takes a certain amount of courage to do so, and particularly to give your real name. But we have to know how often this is happening to people. Men have to be warned. I mean, families out there have no idea. Parents say to me, oh, my son's a good boy. He will never get into trouble. And I keep saying, there is no protection. You know, even if you never go near a girl, she can allege you did brush her. You know, you went past her and you touched her boob, whatever it is. She can lie. Women are lying across the country, across the world, because they're getting rewarded for this stuff. You know, I had a famous rape case in Australia, a woman called Brittany Higgins, who was found in Parliament, half naked, pretty pissed, pretty drunk, in the middle of the night. And when she was about to lose her job, she turned around and accused a guy a colleague who'd come in with her, of raping her. And this case went on for years. I mean, it's gone for years and years. She's just been given nearly up to $3 million from the government compensation, even though the case ended up falling apart in court. Her cross-examination was a disaster. She was proved to have lied on any number of issues. There's been footage. They've got an audio tape of her plotting. This was used to take down our government. As you know, the previous Conservative government was really destroyed by this accusation. And yet she had this enormous cheer squad. She was given a National Press Club talk. She was lauded across the country, and she still has enormous numbers of people following her. Even though if anyone who looks carefully at that story now knows it doesn't stand up. And I've been supporting her alleged rapist, Bruce Lehrmann. And, finally now he can go outside and people will come up to him and say, I believe you, mate. But it's taken years of his life and destroyed his career.
Well, I mean, that's what it does. Like I said, I lost my job, and then I went through, and you can imagine when these articles get published, I'm not like a public figure or anything. I didn't have any YouTube channel or anything at this stage. I was just working my 9-to-5 job, and it just happened like that. Everyone I ever knew, because it's a big story in Melbourne, all of my family friends, all of my friends, all my teachers, everyone I basically knew would have gotten passed around all of the WhatsApp groups, had thought this of me. And then I was talking to like other guys that I knew about what I was going through. And then I kept on getting time after time after time after time, people that I knew well saying that, oh, I've had something similar happen. You know, I slept with this girl, found out that she had a boyfriend, and then she, regretted it. And then she turned around and said I raped her. And it just constant. And then I actually made a video on the channel a few months ago, and then a part of the video was how to avoid having an allegation against you. I hadn't really told my story. And then I had so many guys reaching out to me in my emails, my Instagram, saying, "Oh, I went through something similar. I wish I had heard that sooner." So as uncomfortable as it is to talk about this, and as much as I know that people are this is going to get clipped up and this is going to get articles written about it and everything, I need to talk about it because there are a lot of guys out there feeling genuinely alone and feeling like that it's over for them, because once you have your reputation smeared as a man, it's hard to come back from.
Very hard, particularly was it true for your case as a young man. You're starting out in your life, and to know that this will be, this bad smell will be around forever. And I'm sure social media didn't carry very much about the fact that it all fell apart, and you were essentially acquitted. I mean, I imagine a lot of your friends don't even know that, do they? Or your acquaintances.
The thing is, Bettina, your hands are tied. There's not really much you can do and say. Like from the pre-court hearing for when I got when the articles started to come out until the charges were eventually dropped, my hands are tied. I've got like a court. It's under criminal investigation or whatever. So I can't say anything about it. And then even after it, like, what am I going to say? I'm going to come out and say, "Hey guys, look, I was," and most people are going to say, "I don't care," A, or B, they're going to say, "Oh yeah, sure. Where there's smoke, there's fire," and this sort of thing. It's not a reasonable thing to say to suggest that women can lie. It's very reasonable if you want to say that men can be violent, but if you want to say that women can be deceptive, we can't say that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, feminists have done a fantastic job in promoting the idea that women don't lie and that there are very few false allegations. I'm actually just about to publish some research or to reveal a really careful analysis of all the data that alleges that the incidence of false allegations is only about 5%. It's probably much higher than that, 3 or 4 times that. And the way they've interpreted those research studies has been really misleading. And we have to get that out there because it's underlying all these debates. I'm at the moment involved in fighting new family law legislation going through in Australia, which is an absolute outrage. Australia has led the world since around 2006. We introduced really progressive family law legislation and enshrined the rights of children to have 2 parents in their lives, and it introduced an assumption of joint parental responsibility. Dad should be involved just as mum is in all the big decisions in the child's life. You should try to have as much shared care as possible. That's where we came from. And we have had country after country coming to Australia to see this shining light of a country that addresses this important issue properly. And the Labor Party is just introducing new legislation to take us back to sole mother custody, alleging that we have to protect children from violent fathers. And it's such an insult to Australian men. Our official statistics shows just over 1%. If you look at the surveys asking women how often they've been physically attacked, physically assaulted, it's just over 1% of Australian women said that they've had physical abuse. If you could introduce emotional abuse, all sorts of other things, the figures go up. But when we talk about domestic violence, we're thinking of physical abuse, aren't we? When we're talking about protecting children from violent men, we're not talking about people yelling at each other. We know women are really good at that. It's about physical safety. And they're alleging we have to take away joint custody because it's too dangerous for children. And the whole of our parliament is lying down and they don't dare come out and say this is an absolute invitation for false allegations.
Oh, absolutely. 100%. And I've seen Mark Latham take a journalist to task on this once. And because if you dropped someone into Australia, they would think that it's an epidemic. They would watch the adverts of these angry alcoholic fathers beating their innocent damsel in distress wives and the traumatized children. And they would think, it's a genuine epidemic. But then you look at the numbers, like the research that you've done, and it's not an epidemic at all. I mean, it's a problem, and obviously we'd love it to be zero. But the way that it's portrayed in the Australian media and in Australian Parliament, it's like I said before. I believe it's opportunistic, and there are opportunistic people who use these things for their benefit. And
it's a huge industry, Jack. I mean, the domestic violence industry makes billions of dollars from alleging there's this huge problem of domestic violence and we have to protect women from violent men. And they, of course, never allow you to. We've got 1,700 peer-reviewed studies that show that in families where there's interpersonal violence, women are just as likely to instigate the violence as men are. Men are more likely to do damage because they're bigger and stronger, but she's often starting it, and starting off hitting a man is a very good way to end up physically being, having a man react to that, and it can be very dangerous, of course, for women to do that. But we never talk about women's violence. We never talk about this research. We're not allowed to talk about this research. I mean, I've been out there for years saying, why aren't we looking at the data? And I don't know whether you know, a few years ago, the feminists sort of took me out. I was stupid enough I accepted an honour from our government for my work for men. The honour was given to me for promoting gender equity through advocacy for men. And of course, I mean, that was a bit of a tease in a sense, but the feminists went bananas over that. And within hours, they were just piling on. They had 2 attorney general. They had the whole Australian Senate condemning me, saying I'm causing danger to children. I'm denigrating domestic violence victims. And of course I never do that. I mean, I'm the first to acknowledge there's a real issue. We have to protect children. We have to protect mothers from dangerous men, and who certainly exist. But we have to look at this really complex social issue in all its dimensions. We have to talk about the fact that children are actually more likely to be physically abused by their mothers than their fathers. Mm-hmm. Our official bodies who study this data on child abuse won't even release data on the gender of the perpetrators, because they know it shows that mothers are more dangerous than fathers. So they cannot have that out there. I mean, it's just incredible. Every institution in Australia has been captured by the feminists, and it's just terrifying.
And I don't know how you feel about this, but I feel like it makes the problem a lot worse in terms of men, because like they say, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, but hell hath no fury like a man disrespected as well. And if you disrespect a man like that, if you try and keep him away from his children, if you try and make him pay child support to have kids that he never sees while you've got another man raising your kids, that will lead the wrong kind of man to do very dark things. And I see that playing out.
Sorry, Jack. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But the problem, I mean, they're very lucky because most men don't do damage. I mean, I call them the powder keg men. I mean, as you say, they're being goaded. She's issuing more and more violence accusations. He's getting a violence order made against him. She then gets the kids to ring up on his birthday. If he picks up the phone, he's breaching that order. He could be sent to jail. I mean, I knew a man who was in this situation. He had endless court cases, which he couldn't even afford to have anyone represent him. He ended up he had the police and he was holding them at the bay with a bow and arrow because he just got beyond himself. He just didn't know where to turn. He went, but luckily, most men, for our society, most men just kill themselves. I mean, 6 of the 8 people who die in Australia are male, and there's really strong evidence that most of that is related to a family breakdown. And what happens to men in family court, which is systematically stacked against them. And yet, most of our domestic suicide prevention money is going to women. Now, how do you justify that?
Yeah, this is one of the most important things. This is when I watched your podcast with Isaac Butterfield, I remember reposting this a few years ago and just thinking, this is really, really important work, because all we get told as men is, if oh, men are killing themselves, so sad, pat on the head, pat on the bum, act more like women. We don't actually get told why, and we don't get told that it is actually relationship breakdowns. And if you look at the demographic of men who are doing it, it's generally men who have lost their families and had these relationship breakdowns and these family problems, who, like you just said, they just check out instead of doing something heinous to other people, or instead of living a life of quiet misery and desperation, they check out. And this is actually something that nobody wants to talk about.
No, there's a woman who works in, she's a farmer and she's an expert on, I don't know, something to do with spraying crops or whatever. But she was seeing these stories all around her. And of course, you know, on the farms, he doesn't necessarily commit suicide in a way that's recognized as such. He'll drive his tractor into a tree, or he'll, you know, he's got a shotgun or whatever it is. There are a lot of unreported suicides in that situation. And she started speaking out about this. And of course, like you, like everybody, you then hear all the stories in your community about, you know, and if you're on a farm, you know, thousands of miles from anyone else, and you have to have a court appearance, what are you going to do? How can you go and attend that court? I mean, there are so many men who are just driven to absolute despair by what's going on in our family court system, by what's going on in our criminal court system. I mean, that has been totally captured by the feminists, who are doing a brilliant job tilting our laws to remove traditional justice, traditional protections from men who are facing a serious sexual assault charge, to ensure that, you know, we're believing the victim. And I mean, you know, one of the things I've been doing, well, a few years ago particularly, is talking about what's happening on our campuses to the, you know, kids, young men who are students. We actually, this is all, funnily enough, came from Joe Biden. Joe Biden, I think it was about a decade ago or even longer, announced that he was going to change the sexual culture of America. And he was going to do that on the campuses he required all campuses that were receiving government funding to set up tribunals to adjudicate sexual assault. So you take it out of the criminal law system where men have some protection, and you put it into secretive committees where they don't even have lawyers, they don't have any of the normal, you know, right to cross-examination, you know, the things that give you a little bit of a chance of defending yourself, and then they throw you out of uni. And so this was started in America, and then it came here, and I was writing about it 10 years ago, saying this is on its way. And lo and behold, we did exactly the same thing here. And I went out, I had a lovely time for a few years, because I went out on campuses to say, I saw that there's a fake rape crisis here. Yep. And I mean, the feminists went crazy trying to shout, stop me. And, you know, one of the universities announced that I wasn't allowed to speak because my talk went against the values of the university. And I got the media involved and said, you know, what is it you're talking about on campus? It's clashing with the values of the university. And then at Sydney University, they had to get the riot squad in to protect me. And anyway, it was all very entertaining. But it also, you know, I was really getting somewhere in drawing attention to what was happening to these kids. These kids just break my heart. Yeah, I think of them as boys. They're the age of my sons, or even younger. And they're, you know, they often have told, when they contact me, they've told nobody. They often even haven't told their own parents what's happening to them. They're just so freaked out that they could, you know, they're immediately thrown out of the colleges. If they're living at the university, they're not allowed back on campus. And then they face these tribunals. I've got a team of lawyers who've been fighting these cases, fighting with the university to get a proper hearing. I mean, cases where they go to court and the court throws it out, and then the university decides to have a second go. I mean, the whole thing is just madness, but there's no oversight. There's no recording of what's happening here. These are all, as I say, secretive committees making these decisions. And the kids, just terrible. I had my first campus case, went to prison this week, and it was just devastating. We were talking to him. He was texting in this criminal case, and suddenly he disappeared. And then I finally got hold of the lawyer, and he said he's gone to prison. Now, this is a PhD, Chinese PhD student, really smart guy, doing really well. He's giving talks at conferences and so on. And he meets a Chinese girl, they have a relationship that she breaks it off in the end because she felt he wasn't quite good enough for her. And then she took a good look at the dating scene and came back and wanted to get back together again. And he wasn't interested. She openly threatened him. If you don't get back together, I'll accuse you of rape. And that's what she ended up doing. He's got text messages. He's got phone messages where she's making that threat, all of which was presented to the jury, and they still convicted him. And he went straight to jail. I mean, what do you do with that?
Yeah, this is, and I feel for that guy. I mean, going to prison for it is ridiculous. But if you look at all of the behavioral psychology literature, it tells you the same thing, is that women are much more inclined towards reputation destruction, innuendo, and gossip. And that's how they manifest aggression, because everyone's aggressive in some form. Men tend to be more physically outright aggressive. Whereas anybody who's been to a girls' school, when I speak to girls about their experience at girls' schools, they'll know that they will go for the reputation jugular and they will not stop. And there's always that one girl who used to be friends with everyone who's now on the outskirts, and she's like the worst person ever. And then eventually she gets brought back into the circle. And that's just kind of how they do it. And then guys, if you go to
girls, they're terrifying. I mean, I had a teenage daughter, I've raised. I mean, I've watched all that, and there's been so many books written about what happens to girls. They're vicious. Do we think that suddenly disappears when girls become adults? No. It just gets directed onto guys. And look, every relationship ends, every dating relationship. I mean, unless you've actually met the person you're going to settle down with or whatever. So most end badly for someone. And you can bet your bottom dollar if it's a guy and the girl who wanted the relationship to go further or thought it was the start of something wonderful, and he turns around and said, well, or he just, whatever, what it's called when you ghost them or
ghost them. Yeah, that's the term.
Decided never to. Right. You know what I mean? They're all over each other, texting each other and so on, and suddenly he disappears. Well, that's classic. Now she can get at him. All she needs is one little allegation that he's stuffed.
100%. And even if it goes just to your friendship circle. I was just going to say, like, even if it just goes around the friendship circle or just goes to the media, it's the exact same thing. I mean, you either way, that's in the ether now, and people will think, people won't go and investigate it. They'll just believe it.
Yep. And we've got all this other stuff on social media, like girls, persuading a guy to send him a dick pic, whatever, and then they spread it. The idea that it's always males, ghastly males, doing that stuff to women, it's not. It's working. And in fact, there's more of it, boys being targeted for sexploitation than there are girls, and no one talks about that. Being blackmailed, you give me money unless, I'll show everybody this photo, whatever.
Yeah.
All that stuff is going on.
And this is another thing as well, especially that pertains to my case, is that if you would know this, that a lot of times with these cases, there will be opportunistic women or people around the opportunistic women who will go to an athlete or an entertainer or somebody in the public eye, and they will have these false allegations, but it will never get to the media because they'll sign a non-disclosure agreement, $50,000 and a new car, and nothing ever gets said about it. But then occasionally, you get the guys who say, kiss my ass, I didn't do anything wrong, you're not getting a single penny out of me, and you can do what you want. And those are the ones that end up getting to the media. But a lot of them actually don't end up because there will be something that happens behind closed doors. So, I mean, what do you do if you're a guy? Do you sort of bow your head and give money and basically bend over at this allegation, or do you fight it and you take the reputation damage?
But also all these guys, like the footballer, like the politician, powerful men have women throwing themselves at them. I'm sure your friend knows that. There would have been girls coming onto him all the time. And they're in such a dangerous spot. One of the other areas I talk a lot about is what I regard as an enormous area of men's restraint, which is the fact that many men are going through most of their marriages totally sex-starved. And they go into a marriage thinking, this is going to be a loving, she's really all over me. We can't get enough of each other. This is the rest of my life. And after a few years, she's not interested. And that's absolutely classic. And we are seeing, it's very interesting. If you look at the research, we're seeing a growing gap in sexual desire in people in long-term relationships, with women increasingly likely to lose interest. And men are more likely to, not all men do, I mean, some men lose interest too, but lots of men retain interest in sex through most of their lives. And it's an absolute tragedy to lie, to be still in love with your wife, to lie next to this gorgeous woman night after night, or the woman you think is gorgeous, and she won't let you near her. And most men want to be faithful. They don't want, they believe in monogamy, or they don't want to go out and pay for sex or whatever. And to go, I've had 30-year-olds write to me and say, I can't face the thought of the rest of my life with no sex. I just don't know what to do. And we've gone from a situation in the 1950s where sex was part of the wifely duty, it's part of the marital obligation, to a situation where you're not even allowed to talk about the fact that, there is no sense of obligation at all anymore. Women have a right to say no, and that can mean saying no for the next 30 years, and men aren't in a position to complain about it. Yeah. If they go to a relationship counsellor, they'll end up talking about the housework, because the relationship counsellor is usually a woman, and she'll say to the woman, oh, what isn't he doing? Why don't you feel like saying, oh, well, if he'd help me wash up a bit more, I have so much to do and I've got the baby. And that's, it's very rare that counsellors really get what that's like to spend your life begging for sex.
Yeah. And I don't know if you've noticed, but there's been a big sort of almost like a revolution on the internet. They call it the red pill movement. And what it is basically guys knocking about on the internet, all just trying to figure out how the hell to navigate this situation. It gets a really bad rap. And I do see why, because there are a lot of people, like I said before, that are opportunistic, that will see the trend and then who will be really inflammatory and provocative unnecessarily. But there are a lot of guys out there who are turning to these spaces because they don't know how the hell to interact with women these days. They don't know how to hold a conversation. They're terrified of having sex with a girl because they're scared that they might do the wrong thing or say the wrong thing or have a false allegation. They get absolutely no play on dating apps whatsoever because, they're not as appealing, I guess, and the dating market's always changing. So there are vast swathes of young men, and myself included. I've gone to these channels sometimes and looked for dating advice and looked for this and that. And they get demonized a lot. But I think this is a direct response to feminism and to all of the various things we've been talking about today in terms of the man bashing, and also what you just talked about, which is guys that can't get sex from even their own partners. And they're trying to figure out, how do I make my wife respect me? Because I think that that's what it comes down to at the end of the day is being respected. And if you're respected, then she's probably not going to try and leverage sex. Go on.
It can be respect. But, I did this terrific project, which was getting couples to keep diaries. I wanted to find out, what is it? I mean, why has she gone off sex? Doesn't she respect him anymore? Doesn't she deserve? And there are plenty of women who said, I love my husband. I think he's terrific. He treats me absolutely perfectly. I'm just not interested. There is, I think, a really strong biological issue at the heart of this. Anyway, it's a sort of complex issue, but it's not necessarily true. It's anything to do with the way he's treating her. There are many women who just, where their libido drops a little and they never bother to work on themselves to keep that flame alive. Women have to make a concrete decision to keep sexual in a relationship, to keep interested, to not just turn off the tap. And it means, sometimes I talked about the issue of just do it. Sometimes you have to put the canoe in the water and start paddling and see what happens, right? It actually comes from really important research from a gynecologist in Canada. And she looked at women a whole bunch of women who hadn't been interested in sex for years and years and years, and asked them, about this issue. Do they ever find that sexual desire kicks in once they get going? And there were a lot of women who don't have any desire at the start, but know once they put the canoe in the water, and if the man knows how to make love to them properly, then they'll click in. They don't have to have desire at the beginning. They'll still get aroused. They'll still reach orgasm. They'll have a good time, and then they kick themselves and think, why don't I do that more often? But the initial thing is that willingness to be receptive, as she described it, willingness to think, I won't always feel like it, but I know it'll be good for me and I'll really enjoy it when we get going. Now, unless they have that willingness to make that effort, sex isn't going to happen, because the feminist message is, if you don't want it, you don't have to do anything. Tough luck. You can go jump, right?
Yeah.
And I totally agree with you about the dating. I was an online dating coach for 5 years, about a decade ago, because when online dating started, I thought it was just such a fascinating thing. I was mainly dealing with middle-aged women, which is a very difficult market, because these women in their 40s and 50s were, they had. The trouble with women is their shopping list gets longer and longer and longer. The more experience they get, the more they feel entitled to. And yet, of course, their market value has gone down and down and down. And it was a hell of a job to teach them to be realistic about who they can attract, and also to teach them to think about, what do I have to offer a man? Not what do I want, but why on earth would a man be interested in me? How am I going to make him happy? That mindset is really not very prevalent at all,
Yeah.
Anyway,
it's funny because you were sort of a little bit earlier there, and I'm wondering how you interpret that whole scene. If you've done any sort of research into why men are turning to online so much these days, because from my vantage point as a young guy, I understand how difficult it is these days to actually compete, A, in the masculine hierarchy, because we're constantly pussified, to be crass, and B, in actually just getting the attention of women, because social media has actually caused their standards to just go up so much. And you have girls who are not really bringing that much to the table, who are wanting top tier guys and have the whole laundry list. So it's very difficult these days. But how do you interpret it?
I mean, you look at it, because there's really lots of good research from the social media, the platforms, the Tinder and so on, analysing what are the men and women looking for. And of course, you're quite right. I mean, women are ridiculously unrealistic about who they can attract. They won't look at any man who's under 5'10" or 6 foot, or even though they might be tiny. I mean, just maddening, this. And the whole business, I mean, I've always been very conscious of young men spending the first decade of their lives being rejected, and lots of guys. I mean, that whole thing about the sports guys, the really good-looking guys get 80% of the sex and all that stuff. But of course, it's true. There are men who get more women than they could possibly deal with, and the women are all competing for the same guy. And all these lovely, normal guys don't even get looked at.
Yep.
Oh, the whole thing drives me crazy. And it's not surprising that when things start to turn around, when men hit their 30s, and maybe some of these guys have got a good job and they're earning a bit of money and they're more attractive, and all of a sudden the women are really resentful that these guys don't always behave well. Why, they've had decades or over a decade of being treated really badly by women.
It's so funny you should say
It
that,
doesn't
because you're what
respect, does it?
yeah. I mean, what you say actually, it really aligns with what some of the guys in the sort of the red pill space will say, which is that you have to spend your whole 20s developing yourself as a man, because when you're in your 30s, you start to peak as a man. And then they say, well,
Yeah.
a lot of these guys are saying, well, I'm not going to be faithful to just one girl because I've worked my whole life to get to this point, and you think that I'm just going to. And so there's that tipping point that's happening now where it's a lot of guys are saying, well, I want to get to my. So what is that? What was that?
I thought that's hilarious. But
Hump.
then an expression, hump and dump. I mean,
Hump and dump.
they're going out there and treating women really badly because they can, because they've finally got the opportunities they dreamt of. But that's a tiny minority. I mean, there are an awful lot of men in their 30s who are really delighted to find girls who are interested in them.
Definitely.
And, make careful decisions, and they're wanting to settle down, and, okay. But I totally agree with all that stuff about teaching males how to cope with this very hostile dating world. And what is it that makes you attractive to women, particularly when it's so superficial? I mean, the Tinder stuff, the business of picking up someone through texting, I mean, it's so hard.
And a lot of the time, the women these days, what I've found with my dating life is that even when I go to Eastern Europe, for example, or when I go to these various European countries, I do all my dating there because these women are quite feminine and they know how to treat a man. Like they treat you with respect. It's called simping. That's another term that when a guy is a simp, it means it's called simping. So if a guy is a simp, that's a bad thing. It means that he's giving and he's not getting in return. He's just simping. Okay. But the girls here will simp on you. But the way I see it is that the simping behavior from the women, I reward that because I like to be doted on. But if I try and dote on a woman, she won't have it. She'll just kick me to the curb. It's a bit of it's a different dynamic. But the dating here is the dating here is so much better because the women actually kind of understand what men are after, which is to be respected and to be treated like a man. Like then you say this and the feminists will say, oh, so you're insecure. You have to be respected. I'm like, it's not because I'm insecure. It's just because I'm a man and I want to be respected. And just like you want to be protected, even if you don't admit it. And you want someone who is competent, and you want someone who's responsible, and you want someone who, who's a leader, and all of these sorts of things. I want someone. Yeah, exactly. There's no shame in it. Yeah. And I want somebody who I feel like I can protect and who respects me for that. And that works really well. But then in Australia, I find that a lot of girls these days are conditioned to not look for that at all. They want to be the boss, and they want to be, they're pretty disrespectful at times, and they find it funny to belittle a guy. And I look at that and I say, well, your man's never going to be happy if you belittle him like that. And these girls these days, they don't really understand that.
I mean, I totally get it. I mean, if I was an Australian man, I think I'd look elsewhere.
Yeah. It
can be very gorgeous, but I mean, I think what they're being taught about relationships is essentially so destructive to the qualities you need to care for each other. You want a woman who's generous towards you, sexually generous, kind. This whole notion of building you up, saying things that make you feel good. We both want that. Why is it that we're not even allowed to talk about that anymore?
Yeah. And one more thing I wanted to touch on with you, Bettina, because I know that I won't hold you for too long, but just in terms of the case that I went through, I'm wondering about the advice that you give to your sons, because I found that was not only very detrimental to my own personal life for a year, and it was embarrassing, and I had to, and my family had to go through it, and all of these sorts of things. It actually made me a worse person for a little while, I found, because it made me much more careless about my reputation, and it made me much more like promiscuous, and people think this about me, whatever. I'm not trying to impress anyone anymore. And eventually I had to come full circle and be like, no, actually, my reputation is important. It's important that I still have self-respect. And so it's very damaging in many ways. And I guess what I wanted to ask you was, you've got boys. What is your advice to them to be avoiding those types of situations? And if they do happen to find themselves in such a situation, how to navigate it?
Yeah, it's funny. We've just been thinking about how would we put together advice for boys. My son is married with kids. We're a bit past that now, thank goodness. Both my sons are sort of settled down, but I've always preached extreme caution, because I don't think there's any way of protecting yourself. And, the business of how do you pick the right woman is absolutely critical. I think both my sons, this book I was talking about, Sexual Desire, was called The Sex Diaries. And I think they both gave their girlfriends this book, which has this very strong message of, in a sense, looking after your man, but it's really looking after each other. There is a mutual obligation to care for each other sexually, just as there is in every other way. But that's a very old-fashioned message. But I think it was a good way of testing out whether this is a relationship that's going to last, to see how they felt about that. But, there's no guarantees. And you can think you're really onto a winner, and then 5 years later, you're in a divorce court or whatever. Really difficult. I'd be grilling with a woman about her attitudes towards family law, and, but no one ever knows how they're going to behave when they're in that situation. That's the trouble. Most of us, when it comes to divorce, are at our very worst. We're really hurt and angry, and then we have lawyers, coming in and say, "Why didn't you do this?" And you always look back and think, "Why did I behave like that?" But and I think there are a lot of good women, decent women, who get hauled into this horrible business of destroying a man. But the whole society is telling them that's what you should do.
Yep.
You have to look after your kids. You have to get more money. You have to keep him. He's been violent to you. He yelled at you, your mother-in-law, whatever. You have that message coming in from all sides now, that men are dangerous. Men are, there's no real need to keep the man in the children's lives, whatever.
And just briefly, I've got two more quick questions for you, if you don't mind. When you're speaking to young women who are in a relationship and who are looking to get married and who are quite conditioned by the feminist narrative and by the societal programming, what's your advice to them, and how do you sort of try and untangle that?
I find young women so frustrating. Look, there are lovely girls out there, lovely women, who haven't. I think anyone who describes herself as a feminist, I'd stick here.
Just
clear on.
Let's just make it a woman who's open to learning and wants to and is interested in what you're saying, not someone who's too far gone, but someone who's interested in what you're saying, wants to make her man happy. Doesn't know how.
I think get rid of everything you've been taught for the last decade or so. I think so many of the messages in society are so damaging to young women. Stop thinking of yourself as a victim. I was of the first generation to be allowed sexual freedom, to be allowed to go out without chaperones, to, if we like, to behave like men and choose our partners and go to bed with them if we want to do, and so on. That was about independence, and that came with risks. Don't always think of yourself as a perpetual victim in need of protection. That's a huge step back. My generation of feminists fought for the freedom that you're now tossing aside because you want protection and you want to be up on some pedestal. And that's just madness. Live life, take risks, look after your man. If you care for a man, he'll look after you. And trust in the good in me. Most men are good blokes, and they want to do the right thing by you. And if you care for them, they'll give it back in spades.
That's amazing advice. And the last question I've got for you today, Bettina, is, and this is a tough one, but for guys like myself, a few years ago when I was going through the storm and the height of things, or for guys who have had their families taken away, or for guys who are going through these divorce courts, what kind of words of advice and wisdom can you offer? And what are some of the resources that are available? And how would you communicate with these guys?
I think it's terribly important that men don't get isolated. So if you're going through all of that, find some sort of support group. I mean, it is true. That's one of the things we were talking about, the way they're treating suicide. And they always say, men have to learn to behave like women. Well, men, and, they need to learn to cry more. Well, they do need to learn to reach out. I mean, and it's been one of the things that makes men incredibly vulnerable, that they tend to bottle it all up and then drink too much, or, whatever it is. There are organisations everywhere. You sometimes have to look very hard. We had a very good organisation called Dads in Distress. They've had to rebadge themselves, called Parent Beyond Breakup, because you're not allowed to have an organisation for men anymore. But they're still there. Dads in Distress for men who are going through divorce, and they have groups, they have counselling, sensible advice from other blokes who know what it's like. I think that's really important. I suppose a lot of men have women in their lives. They may not have thought about it. Ex-girlfriends, school friends, whatever. Reach out and find sensible women who could be friends to you, that you can talk to, as well as talking to other men. I think that's really important. Men's isolation is a real vulnerability. And we see that particularly with very much older men. We've got a fantastic organisation in Australia called Men's Shed, the Men's Sheds organisation, which is about particularly bringing older men together to do things with each other. They make furniture. They have a shed, and they make furniture, and they do community projects and stuff, because men, of course, are much more comfortable talking to each other if they're screwing a pretty good screw in a hole. What I mean? They're making things, doing things. They're next to each other rather than talking face to face.
Yes,
and
definitely.
This Men's Shed movement was part of that, and I think it's really important, that sort of thing. But that's usually pitched at older men, but it's still doing a lot. I think it's doing very valuable work, bringing men together. But there are organisations of men going out and having dinner together. This whole business of you can't be seen as a guy out with other guys. It's just crazy, and we have to get around that, because it's usually very socially prescribed when you could go out with another bloke. You could go to a football match. You could go, but you couldn't just go to a movie with a guy, could you? I mean, that might be. There are a lot of things that we prescribe how men are supposed to behave, and I think some of that has to break down for your own protection.
Fantastic. Well, Bettina Arndt, you are a breath of fresh air in this conversation. We need more mums with sons looking out for their cubs, and I really do appreciate your voice, and I appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Jake. Could you tell everybody should subscribe for my free blog, which is on Substack? So I'd love more people to start reading that.
Sorry, I always forget to tell people to plug themselves at the end, but I'll leave all of that linked in the. I'll leave all of that linked in the comments and at the top of the bio, and everyone can go check you out.
I mean, I'm about the only person in Australia speaking out for men. And I know a lot of people would like to read more about what's going on here.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Bettina.
Thanks very much. Thank you for speaking out about what's happened to you. I think that's really important.
Yeah. I kind of feel like I had to. So thank you.